How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tear Talk. Guys, I'm going to do one more discussion that's coming from this book, Corrections Interrupted, How to Rebuild After a Critical Incident. It's an ebook that's now available on Amazon along with my many other books, whether it's Blue 360 Media or whatever I have left on Amazon. I got a few good books that are now new ebooks. So we have that one, as I just mentioned. We have Warden's Wisdom. We have Rank Before Ready. And we have Surviving Without a Mentor. And guys, these books are only $9.99. Eventually they will be published, but for now they're available and be put right in your hands. But today I want to discuss a passage from this book, and it's passage 5. And the title of this passage is The Strongest Policies Fall Apart If the Culture Isn't Ready for Them. And I think that's something that goes unnoticed by management. And the context of this is actually introducing policy after a critical incident. And this video here actually partners very well with the video I did last week, again, relating to recovery after a critical incident. This is something that's dear to my heart. I have never worked in a facility where an officer was taken from us, but I do remember going again to North Carolina and kind of working with staff and talking to them as they went through the loss of, I have a picture of her right now, Sergeant Megan Callahan. Again, guys, this was a tough moment. A lot of people had a lot of different emotions. They didn't know how to work through it. Management was confused. You know, they're walking into something that is on the surface seems almost impossible to fix. But again, that's why I created this ebook. This ebook is to provide some guidance to help facilities or people that have gone through this to work their way through it. So it's going to be a great discussion. And my guest today is going to be Russ Hamilton. And what we're going to do is going to walk through this passage. I believe there's 2 quick narratives, but there's also a bunch of tips along the way. And then I have a question at the end of each section that me and Russ are going to explore. And we're going to get personal because this is a personal topic. But let me get Russ. What up, Russ?
Hey, Anthony. How's it going, sir?
Good. Hey, Russ, you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Russ Hamilton. I am a former and retired sergeant from California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. This is my dog, Charlie. And what are you doing back there? Anyway, I've also been a senior juvenile correctional officer. I currently work for a company that does reentry and rehabilitation work for a local county jail and a local county probation department. I am also the founder of Keepers of Chaos with a K on Facebook. And I think that's kind of it for right now. I'm getting ready. I've got a book. Don't quite have the full title yet, but the working title is going to be something like Complacency in Corrections, and looking forward to this discussion.
Yes, now be mindful, guys. This is a union show, so Russ's dog can be on screen, but just cannot have any lines.
That's right.
Wait till we agree with that. All right, so Russ, I got this. This is passage 5 from the book I mentioned, Corrections Interrupted, which is now available. And basically, it's the strongest policies fall apart if the culture isn't ready for them. The tagline for this chapter is why timing, trust, and emotional readiness matter more than the ink on the directive. So you can write the perfect directive, but if the environment doesn't trust it, it won't hold. And I think that's kind of makes a lot of sense to me. I think as management, sometimes after a critical incident, and we'll probably be discussing this, but you know, we try to get immediate control to basically, you know, control what has happened, try to get that lockdown, you know, try to do what we can to add that extra measure that we have everything under control, things are stabilized, and then we start putting in memos to basically overcorrect. And then what happens here is one thing that we may not be wary of as management is that we're throwing these policies down into a culture that may not be ready for it. And what we're going to talk about today is how policies could be perceived even based on good intent, when the culture isn't prepared to receive them. And I'm sure that makes sense to you, correct, Russ?
Yeah, you know, when we talk about, you know, the aftermath and the after action review of a critical incident, particularly one where there's been injury or loss of life. The people that are involved are humans after all. And, simply going in there and, dictating a bunch of stuff, some of which is probably very necessary, some of which may be CYA strictly, and some of which, just may be knee jerk reactions to things that are going on are, not always going to be received in the spirit of learning and trying to better the profession, because it's sometimes seen as an affront to what they were doing when the incident happened. And so I think that this is, something that's sobering for everyone all the way around. And there's no easy way to take it. There's no easy way to get around it. And I think, it's really incumbent upon, management and admin to be able to do the groundwork to start, redoing policy, redoing procedure, and start, a higher level of training, if you will. And that's the prep work to do it. And you can't do it without prep work, or it's not going to be received well. And it's probably not going to bring anything to fruition. We want things that are, well-founded, well thought out, and well planned to bear fruit. But sometimes some of those things are not going to be any of those things, and sometimes they're just not going to be well received.
Yeah, and guys, you want to hear something funny? So when you go out to interview for these prison management positions, they're very good with asking you questions about policy that relate to high levels of emergency, an escape, a riot, a death of a staff member. It gives you questions that are very typical and very defined by the memorization of a policy or whatever, the procedure within the policy. But some things that they don't ask you, or one main thing, is dealing with the human emotion when a major incident occurs. So this book and what we're going to discuss now tries to manage that gap, because I don't think that is something that we think about, but it's probably the most essential thing. Yeah, I may know policy to a T on what happens when you have a riot, and we may know exactly how to handle that by the book. But then, what about afterwards, when the culture has been disrupted, when the safety that we assume would always be there has now been violated? And that's kind of what this is about. So the first part of this passage is a quick little narrative, quick little story. And it's the directive came down, but nothing changed. So the policy hit inboxes at 8:04 a.m. It was bold, direct, detailed, the result of weeks of internal review and administrative meetings, titled Post-Incident Conduct and Procedural Enforcement Enhancement. It laid out new expectations in response to the recent staff assault, stricter movement protocols, revised communication chains, clarified responsibilities for floor staff, and mandatory post-event debriefings for all involved employees. The memo was well crafted, legally sound, and operationally clean. And yet in the days that followed, the policy barely held. Supervisors quietly reverted to old routines. Officers read it, nodded at it, and tucked it away. One even joked in the locker room, yeah, this will last until the next warden visit. Another said, looks good on paper, but I'm not getting jammed up for enforcing something they won't back when it gets ugly. Within 10 days, nothing had actually changed. The problem wasn't the policy. The problem was the timing, the tone, and the trust deficit it walked into. Because even the strongest policy, Russ, won't stand if the culture isn't ready for it. Do you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with it from the standpoint of this is a potential something that could happen, has happened, will happen again in the future. I think that, the fact of the matter is, when you are implementing top-down policy and procedure, there's always going to be resistance. And when you do that, in combination with, a critical incident, all you're going to do is set yourself up for failure. I think that when you talk about, okay, yeah, the new policy and procedure hits at 8:04. Where at 8:04, obviously, it came from an email somewhere. Where is the buy-in for this thing? Where is the training for implement it? Where is the review of the things to see, hey, what's going to happen when we change this policy, but X, Y, and Z happens. And just the fact that there's no chance for everybody to get in there, challenge the policy, see what the good parts of it are, find where the weak links are, and ask the people who are actually going to have to implement it. It's kind of that thing is there's people up there perceived, and in a lot of cases true, by the troops in the trenches there. They're up in the ivory towers and they are down in Reelsville.
Yeah, and Russ, what you're saying is spot on about buying, because let's just say critical incident happened, right? So now there's liability. Something's been exposed. So now people are concerned about it happening again. That's always going to be the concern. So there's urgency. So management may decide, hey, we got to protect liability. So at this point here, let's push something down just to say we're doing something. But the problem is, you're right. You're pushing it down so quick that maybe your staff, one, wasn't ready for it, or two, they haven't participated in how it was developed. So now you're trying to get buy-in on the back end. And that's not how policy development works. Policy development should work with investment on the front end so you could get the buy-in on the back end. But this is probably one of the biggest things that do happen after a critical incident is everybody gets concerned because of the liability that they push things out in urgency without really checking what they're pushing things into. And more importantly, and I like this, is the staff ready for it? So the question I have here, Russ, is, again, we kind of discussed it, but, why do some policies get announced but never really take hold? And how can leadership tell when the culture just isn't buying in?
Yeah, and that's the thing is if people are looking at this new policy and going, man, I don't know what's going to happen if I go full throttle and just start implementing this. Have we notified the inmate population if it affects them in a way that it's going to come back? Where is the pushback going to come from? And and who's going to back me when everyone else out here is just saying, nah, we're safer running it at the level that we were before, because none of this stuff has been taken to the level where there's some type of top-down integration. That's the way I'll phrase that. And instead, it's just top-down ivory tower. You people down there on the bottom make it work somehow, some way, and it's certainly not fair.
Yeah, and I want to mention something too, Russ. We'll have to get your thoughts on this. So, let me just push these notes to the side here. So when you're management and a critical incident happens and we're trying to figure out what happened, so there's probably silence, right? There's probably silence at this point. Silence is never neutral. We fill that silence up sometimes with our own insecurities. So what happens here, when you start pushing policy, it kind of like in ambiguity, because the biggest concern right now is staff doesn't know what truly happened. Did they do something wrong? Are they to blame? I mean, everything's just up in the air right now. People will start to interpret the context of the policy or the procedure, and it usually doesn't go in the light that we want it to go into. Like, I may be pushing policy down because, I do want to reinforce some level of structure, but that policy is more for support, not to go after you. But now when we really haven't defined what we're going through and we're not opening dialogue with staff who went through it, like basically we're in silence mode. When you push that policy down, even though the intent may be supportive, it's not coming out to them as being supportive. They're coming out as, here it goes, Now this policy's done in spite of, us technically. So I think when you're pushing policies down without really understanding what the situation is, and then talking to the people so they understand where we're at, the policies actually wind up killing morale. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely, that's the kind of thing where, and you see it all the time, and sometimes and sometimes I would say that that the line level staff are in the wrong for not embracing it. But over the years, sometimes what you see is they get so used to having to push back for things that they were never involved with, that even when an ostensibly good policy comes along, they're not touching it because they sense that it could be a trap, so to speak, or that somehow this one is going to go wrong too, because there was never that buy-in. There was never that feeling again. Like I talked about Reelsville. Reelsville, is where the rubber meets the road. And from the ivory tower, it's very hard to see. What those things are, how these people are going to be affected, and too often the people at the bottom feel that it's just dismissed as, deal with it, you'll figure it out. And that's just the nature of the beast sometimes, but it doesn't mean that it's right.
Yeah, and I want to mention something too before we get to the next part, is that when you're pushing down that policy, you're pushing it down into a world where staff, as I said, may have fear, may be insecure. They don't know, what's going to happen to them. And now the problem is, even though the intent is to reinforce, the why gets assumed, because the why is not being translated. The why is not ready to be translated. So when you're pushing that policy down, people assume the why, and there's such a filter that they're, assuming from. And I think that's what causes a disconnect, because even if management says, hey, this policy was meant to help you, yeah, but we know nothing about what happened, and we don't have that trust yet after this incident. So how do I know it was meant to be helpful? And then I like what Russ said. Sometimes the culture, even if it's a good policy, culture may just be trained to push back. That's what we do because of how we see the management pushing that policy down, how we view management, how we review anything that they create. So the next part I got, now this really gets into, we're getting good at past the narrative real quick. So post-incident policy is often reaction and not recovery. So it's normal, even necessary, for leadership to reevaluate procedure after a major incident, whether it's a fight, an escape, a suicide, or a staff assault. There's a reflexive pull to do something. Often that something becomes policy, a directive, a tightening of language, a clarification of expectations. But too often, that policy is created in a vacuum, built quickly, written cleanly, and delivered without regard for the emotional condition of the staff expected to follow it. Policy is a tool, but culture is the hand that holds it. If the hand is shaky, if it doesn't trust the tool or the person who handed it to them, the tool won't be used well. Or worse, it will be used in ways that further fracture the environment. A poorly timed or culturally tone-deaf policy can deepen the divide between staff and administration, reinforce the belief that leadership responds with paper, not presence, create backlash where staff enforce it selectively or not at all, or fuel cynicism. They don't care what really happened. They just want coverage. So the ink dries, but nothing heals. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of like where we get into all of these different things keep coming down to the same very few points, and just an inability to trust a process that's predicated on doing something in a hurry rather than getting it right. The thing that should happen after a critical incident is the break that you get is from the lockdown that you employ over that until you have a chance to actually go out there and find out what actually happened. That's part of the investigation. That's part of the report that's written. That's part of the interviews that you've done. And there's a lot of people out there, and I'll just tell you, this is just my own point of view. Is they're more about out there, staking their territory and pissing on a log than they are about actually fixing anything. If people were actually about fixing something, they would be, collecting all of the information and then asking for input and then drawing something up from that. They wouldn't be out there trying to, put their name on a memo and trying to turn the memo into policy and procedure, because that's not the way it should be done. That's like, if you look at the way some things are being run in America today, Congress is no longer involved. They just sort of like say, hey, ATF, go ahead and come up with your own laws. And it's just an end around so that they don't actually have to take any responsibility. And yet they've delegated all the power. And so that's the best analogy that I can come up with. And that's not the way it should be done. That's making sausage, and nobody wants to see that.
And Russ, I like what you said, the ivory tower, because we mentioned here about presence. After an incident, it is very important for leadership to have presence. One, to kind of be there to support their crew, to support their people, but also check the temperature. You could read reports all you want, but you're not going to understand how people feel about what just happened. So you got to go in there and talk to your people before you try to make any suggestions to push policies down. So the question I got here, Russ, is when policies are created in the heat of the moment, how can leaders tell if they're helping staff heal or just making things worse?
I mean, I think there's a lot more to unpack there than I can adequately address. I think that the administrators or managers or what have you have to know what their place is, and they have to be devoid of that. Look at me, ego. I'm about to make a decision. I think probably one of the best things that I ever saw. A manager do, a warden, was be willing to walk across the yard when we just had an incident and ask the staff members there whether or not it was safe to open the yard or not. And everyone there was just like, wow, they're actually asking us. And the decision was yes, we can safely open the yard. We knew who the players were. We knew why it happened. We knew that it did have a gang facet to it, but we also knew that there was good enough reason to believe that nothing bad was going to come from it. And they took our opinion under advisement. And it all worked out. And what did that do? That fostered some trust. That fostered some better input as we went along through the days, months, and years after that. And had a pretty good working. Not everything's always going to be smooth as silk, but had some really good back and forth that really helped run that particular unit.
And Russ, I want to mention something. When you're management and you got to get ready to, let's say, push something through, the urgency thing gets to me because the time frame, sometimes the pressure for urgency is just because someone's pressuring you that has a little bit of political pull. And then you got to ask yourself, are you pushing on this policy so quickly because you don't want to stand up to the pressure from whoever that policy figure is, or are you doing it for the right reasons? Sometimes that pressure leads to management pushing out policies that are isolated. It's true, because now it's more about speed than it is about it being effective. And I think that tends to be the case when you have these conflicts, not conflicts, what do you call it? Crucial incidences, there you go, major incidences, where you got to get something out there. So you're quick to put something out there, like you said, just to put your name on it, showcase that you reacted, but have you really responded? That's the question. Are you doing something long term, or are you doing something to just put your name on it, and then worry about the fallout later on? You can't do that. You know what's funny? I know, corrections does have risk, but usually we can mitigate the risk when we're all involved in creating something together. That's the key, because we all have investment and we can work our way through the greater risk. But when you're doing it in isolation because you just want to put something out there because of the pressure, so you want to get something out there real quick, that's where the risk becomes a bit unmanageable, because now everybody was tossed something their way and they're in the dark. So not only don't they understand the procedure, they don't understand why it's being done. They don't understand what the main goal is. So they have no direction. And then you expect them to succeed when we also haven't dealt with any emotional undertones. So it really is something that I think if you're in management and you want to understand if you're hurting or helping, I think the question is why you're doing it. Is it the pressure, and is this being done in isolation? So now I have a famous saying that I've seen Russ use before, but culture eats policy for breakfast. So there's a phrase often quoted in leadership circles where culture eats strategy for breakfast. And in corrections, you could just as easily say culture eats policy for breakfast and then blames it for indigestion. You can issue a new rule, mandate a new form, or require a new procedure. But if your facility's culture is wounded, mistrustful, or fatigued, staff will absorb that directive through the lens of emotion and not logic. Here's what that looks like in practice. You issue a memo reminding staff to de-escalate before using force. In a healthy culture, that's seen as reinforcement of values. In a fractured one, it's seen as blame. They think we caused this. You mandate a supervisor's presence during all mass movements. In a healthy culture, that's leadership visibility. In a fractured one, it's interpreted as micromanagement. Now they don't trust us to move inmates. You require immediate reporting of emotional distress post-incident. In a healthy culture, that's support. In a fractured one, it's a trap. Say you're struggling and you'll lose your gun post. The policy didn't change. The perception did. And perception in corrections is everything. How many times have I told people this in management? And I've done this in many of my shows too. Even if you don't agree with what the front line's telling you, you still have to respect their perspective, because that is how they are going to see what you're doing, whether it's a memo, a policy, whatever it is. So if you don't understand that perspective, then you're pushing policies down with a tremendous disadvantage. Would you agree with that, Russ? That perspective matters?
Yeah, it does. It does, because you've got to understand that when we talk about the difference between culture and policy, the reason that your managers and admin are so enamored often with the policy phases of it is because it's on paper. It's something that will be seen. It's something that will have a signature on it. It's something that they can point to later or not point to later. And culture, on the other hand, is something that that unless they're out there every single day, well, I say even if they're out there every single day, even if they are out there leading from the front, even if they are getting people to buy in and stuff, where can they point to that? Can they hold that up in a meeting? Can they send out an email about it? No, because no one's going to take that seriously. Policy, on the other hand, gives them a chance to showcase whatever it is that they think that's going on. And so often, this is a bad thing, I'm not saying this is the case everywhere. So what do? They eschew culture, and they showcase policy, because that's the easy thing to do. That's the thing that actually, puts their mark on things. And it's easier to do. It's a lot easier to do. I mean, commanding a unit of people to work under difficult, dangerous, and dirty situations is a tough job. Telling them to implement a new policy is a couple of keystrokes.
Yeah, and sadly, you're right. The paper showcases some level of command and comply, but where's the commitment? Where's the commitment in that? So yeah, it really is. I'm going to push that, and I kind of take it as CYA as well. Vanity. Let's quickly put out something so they know we're doing something. But guys, hold on. We may not be ready. We have no idea what we're throwing something into. So the question I got now is, what does it take for policy to be seen as guidance instead of a threat, especially in a fractured environment? And Russ, I got to say this really matters, kind of what we just discussed before. You got to have trust, and you could build trust after a critical incident. I mean, if anything, that's a time where you have a great chance to build trust, presence being key. But if you don't try to make an effort to build trust, even if it's just, going out there, being visible, showing support, well, the problem is that fractured environment is going to judge everything you're pushing down. And if you don't have the trust, it's not going to come out as support. Whatever you're pushing down, it's not going to come out as something that will help staff. It will be seen in the opposite light. So without trust, whatever you're trying to push down will not work, because staff will see it through their lens. And usually that lens, after a critical incident, if you're not visible, if they can't see you, it's going to go towards the negative. Because sad to say, but a lot of facilities, because there's always been a divide between management and frontline, the status quo, the default, is usually something negative between the two, which is sad. That's why you always have to try to keep that momentum going. In leadership, you got to try to keep building that trust, or else everything you do, even with good intent, becomes an effort in spite of. And that's another thing, Russ, when you're building policies, people automatically collect or connect, like, why was that policy built? And they will define it based on their bias of how they see you, how they see the situation. But what's your thoughts on that one question, Russ? What does it take for a policy to be seen as guidance instead of a threat, especially in a fractured environment?
So here's an unpopular view. What it takes is training, and the type of training that reveals what the thought process is behind what the policy actually states. A lot of these, top-down decisions, it's just like, hey, do X, Y, and Z. And you're looking at that and going, I don't see how this, improves safety, security, anything else. So why are we actually doing it? When if you have a really good, solid policy, you ought to be able to write the reasons behind it and how it's going to impact, and where these pros and, yes, even some cons are. But nobody will do that, because then later, then that's evidence to be used against you, or people are just not good at it, or the fact of the matter is, what they've designed is just a skeleton with no muscle, no meat on the bone, nothing that actually impacts anything. And some people are, satisfied enough with that because it's actually doing the thing that they consider to be more important.
Well said. Now I got the second narrative. There's two narratives here. So here's one more example. It's when policy moved too fast. So at one medium security facility, a near riot during yard recall led to several injuries, including a lieutenant who suffered a concussion. Within 72 hours, a new policy was issued mandating 2 supervisors during all movements and restricting yard capacity to half until further notice. The intent was safety, but the staff hadn't recovered. The briefings had been brief. The debriefings were rushed. There had been no time to process, reflect, or even catch their breath. So the policy, while operationally sound, landed like a verdict, not a solution. I think that's very powerful. I just want to say that again. The policy, while operationally sound, landed like a verdict, not a solution. Supervisors scrambled to meet coverage requirements, leaving other posts thin. Officers vented that they were being punished for something out of their control, and some stopped volunteering for extra movement assignments altogether. The policy had merit, but it was implemented in a context that wasn't emotionally or logistically ready for it. The result? The policy created friction, not just in function, but in feeling, and eventually it had to be quietly revised, not because it was wrong, but because it was early. You know what, Russ? You know what's funny about this, Russ, when I'm thinking about this? A lot of people spend a lot of time, and I'm going to kind of lean back on what you're saying, and I think this complements exactly what you're saying. Is a lot of people will come up with time with maybe developing policy, trying to make sure it sounds perfect, and crosses the T, dots its I's, but they don't spend a lot of time in the rollout of the policy, which I think is more important than the actual creation of the policy. The timing and the rollout. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would tag on a couple of things there, because what actually is the rollout of the policy? Is it just implementation? If it's just implementation, you've already lost, because that's just going for the glory at the end, instead of doing what should have been done at the beginning, which is the developmental phase, because the developmental phase is where you can actually shake it all out. Otherwise, the implementation phase becomes the shakeout phase, and by then you've lost everybody anyway. So I think that's the way I would look at it. It's just too little, too late by that point. When you are rolling it out, and if we assume that your shakeout period has already happened, and that you've got some investment and you've had some input and some good things like that, that second phase is where, once again, you have to ask people, to come in there and, put their skin in the game with regards to making sure that it takes effectively. There has to be that skin in the game. There has to be the meat on the bone to be able to bring the thing to fruition. But so many times, all of those things are lacking, and then everyone's going, "Oh yeah, that was another failed policy that is still there, but it's been superseded by 5 memorandums and a verbal order." It's crazy.
And I have a good question on this, Russ. I said, even when a policy makes sense on paper, what makes it feel wrong in practice? And how could leadership have better prepared the ground for it? So we kind of touched on it a little bit, but any added thoughts on that?
I would say that's kind of hard, unless I could, come up with a really good and valid example. But one thing I'll say is that when you start to implement something, and it's something that, even in a minor way, is impacting the population, the problem with it feeling wrong can come from a couple of different sources. Number one, it can be dangerous, right? I do remember one that's maybe not the greatest example for this, but when we decided that, hey, there's not going to be any more cigarettes in prison, that was good in ways, because we didn't have to suffer so much anymore from secondhand smoke from all the inmates just ignoring about not smoking indoors. But at that point there were a bunch of guys ready to riot over the fact that they weren't able to smoke anymore. So that's one thing. The other one is where it impacts inmates negatively in a way that doesn't seem to make any difference with regards to safety or security. And it just seems like, hey, we're putting a bunch of trouble out there for them, and that's really not worth the effort, because we're not receiving anything for that either. And so I think that those are the two situations that come to mind where you can really see that, and there is that element of danger. It might also come about sometimes if there's a perception that something that's being done might, and this is another probably unpopular opinion, might be negatively impacting not their perceived civil rights, but their actual civil rights. Let me put it that way. Because I'm a big proponent of people having, engaging, and exercising whatever rights it is that they have. And yes, we've taken a lot of inmate their rights away, their freedom, for one, and so forth. But I don't think but I don't think that happens in a vacuum. And I think you have to be careful with that if we want to make sure that what we're doing is fair, in the sense that what we're allowed to do to punish them is given to us by the courts. And if we're willing to look away at any particular time from the oath we took, which is toward the Constitution, be it state or federal, I don't think that that's a good road to go down, because we could end up anywhere with that. I mean, just look at, I won't even say the specific institution. Just look at New York right now. So I think that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, like for me, Russ, I think I agree with you. So like the latter half of this question, how could leadership have better prepared the ground for? We kind of discussed it before, but it's front end investment. So when you get ready to develop something, especially after a major incident, you want that front end investment. Then you want to kind of translate that onto some back end of buy-in, and then ultimately that helps lead towards accountability. But the front end of that is, even when policy makes sense on paper, what makes it feel wrong in practice? And again, we kind of discussed it, but just to keep things in general, because I agree with Russ 100%, the balance of a policy that you're implementing. I mean, was there enough people at the table to balance not just their own role, but how that role interacts with their other roles, and when the priorities shift? So I think there's a lot that comes into play with getting people involved in helping create the policy, but also pace, because you're going to push something on urgency, as I said, just to put your name on it, and it's not correctly put together, you can wind up damaging more than you do building things back up. Now, we kind of touched on this a second, but this will be real quick. Readiness before rollout. So before you drop a policy, especially one written in the wake of a crisis, you must ask yourself, is the timing right? Has the facility begun to stabilize, or are staff still in the fog of trauma? Have we led with presence or just paperwork? If staff haven't seen you since the incident, your memo will not land. Do we understand how this will feel to the people receiving it? What emotions will this trigger? What assumptions will it reinforce or challenge? And are we prepared to explain it, defend it, and walk it consistently? Because once you roll it out, it belongs to the culture. When policy meets people, timing is everything. Trust is everything. And without either, even the best written directive becomes just another piece of paper to survive. And the question I got here, Russ, is before rolling out a new directive, especially after a critical incident, how can leadership balance operational readiness with emotional readiness? And which parts do you think get overlooked the most?
I think after a significant critical incident, it's emotional readiness. I, I think that sometimes there's a divide there between those who just want to push forward and those who are going to have to be doing the pushing. And I think that there's a lot of emotional dysregulation that comes with a staff member being significantly hurt, multiple staff members being significantly hurt, a death in the line of duty. Thankfully, fairly rare, but not something that you can ever discount. So you just can't let it be at that point. Everyone everyone has to be ready in a way that they can react and respond, because it might be the tip of an iceberg. You might have something significant coming right down the pike again immediately, and there's no guarantee that you're going to have time to get better and to function better and to get over things at all. So that's where I see the danger at.
Hey, you know, Russ, I remember. So I'm going to go back to 2017 with Megan Callahan. I remember, trying to shoot that film, which I wish would come out one day. But you saw so many mixed emotions with the people that I was talking to. Regret was big, anger, guilt, fear. So obviously you got all these different emotions, and management now is going to try to implement a policy. But again, it's a policy that's got to meet people. So I like the timing of people, because, what emotion is this memo being passed into? You manage the position, but you lead the people. And I think a lot of people forget about the latter half. It's like, I got to get this facility back and running. So I got to manage the facility, which means I got to manage the positions. But, at the end, we're talking about emotion. You can't manage the positions until you lead people through their emotions. So when I saw all this, and confusion was another thing too, shock, and just so many different emotions running at different times to different people. What are you going to possibly pass down in that moment that would be comprehended in a way that everybody would get the same understanding of not even just what to carry out, but the intent behind it? I think that's what keeps people motivated. Like, maybe you could toss down a procedure and, people could, carry it out robotically. But I think it's the interpretation of why that procedure is needed that gets lost in the emotion of the people that are going through whatever that critical incident is. And that does affect how they carry out what's needed, because it affects their commitment to what needs to be done. So again, you get the compliance, but I don't get the commitment. So now the commitment is what I need to keep things fueled. If compliance runs thin, I know some people say, like, Gangi, when the facility is silent, what is the first thing that you think is happening when a facility is silent? And because now, as I've matured in this profession, it's not even about people being disgruntled. I think just silence comes because people are burned out, and you have to know that. You have to know that from your presence on the floor. Hey, you got a lot of silence going on. Do you know why that silence is? Because if you're not out there on that floor, you got to interpret that silence. To me, that's one of the things that I think management doesn't understand. Sometimes they believe that silence could also mean things are working because nobody is challenging it. So you know what? This is great. We put something into the world and we got no pushback. So things are going good. Well, how do you know? Because no one's saying anything. Yeah, but is that unique? I mean, this crew, is that unique? I mean, do they usually accept this blindly, or don't they usually kick back a little? Oh, not now. They're silent. Yeah, you better watch out, because silence, as I said, is never neutral. And that silence actually could be devastating in the long run. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to process that a little bit. I think the lack. See, how would I put this? I think the lack of any information, negative or positive, coming your way is a sign that you've lost them. There should always be pushback. There should always be input. There should always be some noise, even if it's white noise. Maybe neither good nor bad, but just kind of the buzz of the way it is. Silence, I would say, is the fact that is that they're afraid to talk, because they're afraid of making things worse for them. And so it's a net negative every time.
Yeah. And we're on the same page. It's silence to me could be a quiet acceptance, but you do have a lot of managers that will interpret that silence as, hey, things are going good. And when technically it's not, it's going to fall. So the next thing I got is policy without presence is punishment. So one of the biggest mistakes administrators make is assuming that the strength of a policy lies in its clarity. It doesn't. It lies in its delivery. A poorly delivered policy, no matter how logical, feels like punishment, especially after a major event when emotions are still raw and meaning is still being reconstructed. Staff don't want to read a memo that tells them what they should have done. They want to know what leadership learned and how you plan to help them moving forward. They don't want to be handed expectations in a vacuum. They want to be walked through expectations in the context of recovery, not in the context of liability. And this means talking to people, answering questions, acknowledging discomfort, which most management don't want to do because it's, in their mind, dealing with people's messy, and offering space for feedback, and maybe, just maybe, co-authoring the next steps with the people who have to carry them out, because the policy isn't the fix. The process is. Would you agree with that, Russ?
So here's what I'd say is that if management is suddenly present when you are implementing a new policy, a new procedure, that's a net negative. They should have been there all along. They should have been down there in the trenches. They should have been doing what I would call their due diligence. And the fact that they're only down there to roll out a policy or to see and make sure it's adhered to is a really bad sign, because they believe that their presence is going to make a difference. Their presence should be there for support of the line staff, and it should be ever present and ongoing. It shouldn't be something that's novel. When it happens and it's something that's novel with new expectations coming down, you can be sure that it's because someone is looking to cover their ass. Someone is looking to make sure that it gets done in spite of the misgivings that other people might have. I would say it would be completely different if their presence had been there all along, and now there's no net change. It's just that, hey, the new policy is there. Everyone understands it. We're still here for backup. Things continue along the way they are, except for the new policy. Does that make any sense?
No, it does, because you know what? You want to always build equity in human relations, especially as management, because you got to get people to see you first. So usually that equity and that trust is built on the front end. But with that said, during a critical incident, if you're showing support and you're there for your people, you could build trust really quick, or even in the back end on the recovery, you could build it really quick. But with that said, technically, Russ is 100%. It's constant work. But really should be already established before the crisis occurs. But that doesn't mean, because it's sad to say sometimes management can get tied up too, but it doesn't mean it can't be established during the crisis. It's just you're going to have to work harder to show that support. You're going to have to be transparent with your efforts, because you don't have the trust going into the crisis. You don't have the trust going into the recovery. So that's when management is going to have to come in and make an effort to 100% be supportive. Try to get your staff to be included in what's happening. Like I like the co-authoring. And then again, transparent in intent, transparent in what you're trying to carry out. And I think that does help the process, because you're not moving forward in that fractured culture. Now, Russ, the question here is, how does the way a policy is introduced, whether it's explained, emailed, or co-created, shape how staff respond to it?
I think that that's strictly of a function of once again, just like I said before, bringing on the reasons behind it. Management by memorandum, management by policy, management by procedure, and the whole top-down ivory tower thing is just, it's a losing model. What really matters, once again, if we just go back to the one we were just on, is presence and leadership. And it's easy to say you're a leader from a keyboard. Actually carrying it out in the presence of deadly predators day in and day out is a whole other story. It's a whole other ball game. And so, there are administrators and managers out there who are already scared to death. And I think about said all I'm going to say about that.
No, I just want to revisit one more thing here with the presence. When you're management, everybody's going to be busy. Management sometimes can be very busy with paperwork, holds them to the desk, but they should always know that people are their priority. And, sometimes they may say, well, people are my priority. I have an open door policy. Yeah, but that's very passive leadership. That means you expect the people to come to you where technically you should be going to them. But with that said, it's not an excuse, but, okay, sometimes the day could get away from you. Next thing you know, days become weeks, weeks become months, months become years. And it's like, man, when was the last time I was really down there talking to my people? When was the last time I went down there without a checklist? When was the last time I really, got to know who's out on that floor? So I think this is something that, should be done, obviously, because then when you have to push stuff out, we kind of understand what we expect from each other. But I will say this, because sometimes the time does get away from you. Staff may want to see you out on that floor during those, regular work days, the routine. But when it's the critical, when something happens, it's not a want, it's a need. It's a need. It shifts in its priority. And if you fail, there are certain things that are going to be unforgivable in a staff's eye. They may, if you got good equity with them, they may forgive you if you can't make it on the floor every day. Maybe we stay connected some other way, but they may forgive you with that. But when they need you and you're not there, especially during that critical incident, it doesn't matter how much you did beforehand. It really doesn't. You weren't there when they needed you, and you just lost that momentum. And that's very hard, if even possible, to gain back. So I think that's interesting. Now, Russ, I have this thing here. We got a few more and then we're almost done. I got an academic lens, so I went to some of the books I have on business leadership, and I wanted to talk about organizational readiness and policy adoption. I thought this was interesting. So research and change, and I'm using Cotter's book on this, I think. I have it. Yeah, right there. Lead and Change by Cotter. Hold on, don't go nowhere. Hold on. I use this book for this one. Lead and Change by Cotter. I think you're going to find this part a bit interesting. Research and change management and organizational behavior consistently reinforces a principle administrators and corrections need to hear. The readiness of the environment determines the success of any new intervention. According to organizational psychologist John P. Cotter, that's the book, effective change requires not just a clear plan, but a sense of shared urgency. That's something that is expressed deeply in that book. He also expresses, when it comes to change, how people fear suddenness and what they're letting go. So it's not so much about people knowing they have to do something new, but rather how quick it's introduced and what are they letting go to get to that point. But then they also talk about, Cotter also talks about an effort to bring people together, the sense of urgency, which definitely happens after a crucial incident. The urgency is already there. The reason for people to move forward, to unite, is already there. That's what I wish would happen, because after a crucial incident, there's a huge opportunity for unity that gets overlooked because we're so divided in CYA and liability that we don't think that, hey, this is the time we should be coming together and not pointing fingers. So when people feel that change is being done to them, they resist. When they feel it's being done with them, they adapt, even when it's hard. This applies to correctional policy rollout just as much as corporate change initiatives, especially in the aftermath of a traumatic or destabilizing event. Policies that are not nested in cultural context will fail to take root. They may be technically in place, but they won't live, they won't breathe, and they'll sit on the shelf and be avoided until someone gets written up for not knowing better. And that's not structure, that's a setup. Question I had here, Russ, was what does it take to turn a policy from something that's done to staff into something that's carried with them? And how can shared urgency help make that happen? So you got the context of shared urgency after a critical incident. So, I mean, how is that utilized now to help move efforts forward?
Oh boy, I think that's a loaded question. I think that you have to look at where the sense of urgency is coming from on both sides of the equation, though. There's a side of the equation that generally happens for sure on the people who are most likely to be killed or hurt to want to try and plug the holes with regards to safety and security. As we move up the chain, what is the impetus of the urgency? I mean, is it to preserve life and secure the safety and security of the institution, or are there other motivational factors? And man, I hate to keep harping back on that, but I will tell you, there's a bifurcation somewhere along the lines in almost all institutions, I would say, and it happens somewhere somewhere between officer and captain, I would say. And I know that all places are different or whatever, but just indulge me for a second here, where at least the line staff perception is that their impetus is safety and security, and that there are other perhaps negative motivational factors involved at a certain point up that chain of command. And so, can those be reconciled? Surely they can. However, I would say that I have seen some critical incidents that have happened across the country over the last few years where the divide, and I'm not gonna point those out right now, but where the divide still remains because the safety and security was so badly impinged by upper management, administration, politicians, what have you, that they were in a way culpable for those particular individuals being killed. So, I don't think that I have, it's very difficult for me to articulate my way through that one. I think that one is a little bit dependent upon the culture that already exists within a specific given institution or even unit.
Yeah, and Russ, you made a very good point, because earlier I talked about urgency. So I'm not talking about the pressured urgency of vanity or liability matters, but definitely a vanity. I'm talking about, like you mentioned, and you mentioned it so well, the pressured urgency of, hey, we're all in this together. We want a safe and secure facility. We want to build staff back up. So the things that relate to hopefully a workplace that people can build trust back into. So I truly think that's something that brings us all together, because, it's needed. So I've seen people rebuild after a critical incident and become stronger for it. Again, resilient wise, facilities could be resilient. They don't just what's it called? Bounce back. They bounce forward. Some facilities just bounce back, but really they're static. They're not moving. They're just there. And then some facilities don't bounce at all. But I think the sense of urgency could be something that could be a shared purpose. And then that's something that could be developed on the front end of anything you're trying to implement. So, if we're all on the same page, when we're sitting at that table, we know, like you said, where that shared urgency really matters. So maybe even thinking about what we said earlier, it's what you define as urgent in regards to the priority. Are you doing this because of vanity or CYA? Or are you really doing this because you care for the people that are going to have to implement it? And I think it really comes across in the how of what's being done. Like if I'm involved in the how and I'm front line, okay, let's get it. You got my investment. But if you're pushing down the what, the how, and not even telling us the why, then how do you expect me to buy in when you don't value my life enough to give me input? All right. So the next part I got, Russ, we got two more, it looks like. How to prepare the culture before a policy drops. So before implementing a significant post-incident policy, consider these relational prerequisites spoken through action and not just words. So we got, has leadership been visible and engaged since the incident? Have we created opportunities for staff to voice concerns about existing practices? Do staff feel their reality is understood by decision makers? That's key. Is there evidence of follow through on prior commitments? That matters. That's kind of who you are before you going into the critical incident. And are supervisors aligned or at least informed so they aren't caught off guard by the change? So only when these foundations are laid will the policy feel like part of a broader solution, not just a top-down correction like you talked about, Russ, before. And when the culture is ready, policies don't just get followed, they get owned. So what would it look like if a facility truly prioritized culture, communication, and Russ, you said this before, by the way. You said this, mid-level involvement. So our captains, our lieutenants. So again, what would it look like if a facility truly prioritized culture, communication, and mid-level involvement before rolling out new policies? And where do you think, Russ, the biggest gaps usually are?
So, I'll blame it time and time again in the rollout. I don't know if this is your experience or not, but we used to get policy and procedure, and they'd hand them to you, and then they would say, "Sign here." Is that training? That's not training. That's trying to escape liability so that they can say, "Oh, we told them so." So I think that's a huge disconnect. If you want to talk about, what you should do to prepare a culture is you should be, bringing people into that classroom and having a frank discussion and going through, all levels of what's going on. And that's not necessary with every policy, but here we're specifically talking about policies that are being pushed out there due to a critical incident that happened. And the best that you're going to do is get people to sign that they sign an acknowledgement. Now I guess it's more along the lines of click here on your email to show that you read this directive, or maybe you have to take a test on it. That is not how you prepare people. That is just a lame way of trying to absolve yourself of responsibility and liability. So get down there where the rubber meets the road, down there in the trenches, and do some actual training and have some back and forth, and face the people that are going to have to live with your choices and your developed distributed policy and procedure.
Yeah, and I wanted to revisit one last thing, the mid-level management, the ones that are pressured, the translating the wants and needs of up and down and up, and just kind of sandwich in the middle. I mean, you really got to put energy in them. I think they get forgotten a lot. I really do. I mean, they're the ones that got to put the message out there, and sometimes we speak at them, or what is it? Kind of like, this is what we want done. This is how it has to be carried out. And we don't really care about their perspective, but yet they're the ones that got to sell it to the troops. They're the ones that got to tell us what those concerns are. So, I mean, I think for management that doesn't really put a lot of time into that mid-level part, communication, stuff like that to keep them involved and keep them invested, you're eliminating a very important tool, useful tool in how to keep things moving. If you're, I agree with this. I know the front line carries a lot of the work, obviously, but man, middle management is extremely important because I think for me, middle management deals with a lot more of the emotional burden behind the work. I think that's true because they're the ones that people are going to vent to that have to try to work with the higher levels for solutions. So I think if anybody has to manage the emotional temperature, it's going to be your mid-level managers. So what are you doing for them to manage that mess? Because it's a mess. All right, so last two, here goes. So we got ownership over obedience. Let me get down here. Sorry about that. Lost the spot. All right, ownership over obedience. The best correctional policies don't rely on constant enforcement. They rely on ownership. So when staff understand the why, believe in the how, and trust the who, they carry the policy because it makes sense, not just because they're told to. You'll know you've reached that point when officers start referring to the policy in practical terms, not just formal ones. Supervisors coach implementation instead of just correcting deviation. Staff begin asking questions about improvement, not avoidance. And the tone, and that's important. Let me say that again, though. Staff begin asking questions about improvement and not avoidance. And of course, the tone. The tone in briefings reflect proactive curiosity, not sarcastic compliance. And ownership doesn't happen with signatures. It happens with inclusion. It happens with conversation. It happens with presence before policy. I want to add one more thing to that. It also happens when you empower. You don't delegate tasks, you delegate authority, but prior to that, you have their investment. And then, Russ, what's the difference between staff following a policy because they have to and owning it because they believe in it? And how can supervisors help make that shift happen?
So I think that's the point at which, when people are sticking to policy in a way that they know that it keeps them more safe, that it keeps them more professionally safe, that it keeps the institution more safe, that it helps keep the public safe. And there's a million different things that I could point to, that really, just kind of like, bring that home. And that's the point at which, we should know that the reason that we follow this policy is not just because it makes sense, but because it's proven itself, because of the prior incident, because of prior incidents across the nation, because of the deep insight that was used in order to render this in a fashion that it became adoptable, not just from the signature standpoint, as you just mentioned once again, but from the standpoint of a trained, knowledgeable corrections professional that would sign off it and say, this makes sense. This will absolutely work. And, how many policies can you say that about? Well, probably more than we think, because we tend to give an inordinate amount of attention to those policies that are controversial. But on a day in to day out basis, for the most part, policy is that which actually just does work. But I will add this with a caveat that work up until when? Up until they're tested. Sometimes policies have not been, tested by fire, and people assume that they're going to work. But that's maybe a discussion for a different day.
Yeah, and maybe, I agree. That's probably even worthy of a show in itself. I think for owning it, I think that, it's tough to always get agreement, but you want people to be aligned. And usually they get aligned if they know they've been involved in the process, even if they don't always get their way, as long as their voice was heard. And I think the shift happens when people do look to improve the process and not try to find hindrances. I mean, I've seen that when you got to move things forward and people create more obstacles, and it's like, hey, I want you at the table, but this has to happen, and you're not giving me solutions here. You're creating more obstacles, and I still got to move forward. So again, I also agree with ownership. Ownership is the delegation of empowerment, the delegation of authority to complete the task. And then prior to that, it would be the investment. So here's the final reflection. When policies fail, it's not always about the words. One of the hardest truths for correctional administrators to accept is that policy failure isn't always a written issue or a writing issue. Sometimes it's a relationship issue or a readiness issue or a credibility issue. You might have crafted the perfect document, but if the people reading it don't trust you, aren't ready, or feel unseen, the policy won't survive the floor. Words don't walk tears, people do. And people follow what they believe in. So policy alone doesn't rebuild a facility after a crisis. People do. And if your culture isn't ready, if your staff aren't emotionally steady, if your trust hasn't been rebuilt, if your presence hasn't been felt, then the best written directive will fail to hold. In corrections, culture interprets everything. And if your policy is dropped into an environment that isn't ready to carry it, it won't be embraced. It will be endured and quietly discarded. The most powerful form of correctional leadership isn't the command to comply. It's the ability to shape belief before asking for the behavior. I want to read that last sentence again, or the last two sentences. The most powerful form of correctional leadership isn't the command to comply. It's the ability to shape belief before asking for the behavior. So, Russ, when a policy fails, is it usually about the rules themselves or the relationships behind them? And how can trust and emotional readiness tip the balance?
There's a lot there, but I think I'll just keep it simple. I think that I think it was Mike Tyson that said, everybody's got a plan, and we can substitute that. Everybody's got a policy until they get punched in the mouth.
Oh, I thought that was Ike Turner, Tina Turner's husband.
No, I think it was Mike Tyson. I'm gonna go with Mike Tyson, but that's the truth of the matter is that policy hopefully will be very robust and full of strength, and be able to survive first contact with the enemy, as it were. And people just don't know what it's like down there in the trenches. Inmates are resilient. Inmates are crafty. Inmates have hordes of lawyers on their side, and it is just not an environment that can suffer anything that's in any way fragile. I would, if I were going to liken this to anything, I would say that the world of corrections, the environment of corrections, is like a giant Darwin Award program. That which is going to survive is strictly survival of the fittest. So only the fittest policies are going to survive. Only the fittest people, only the fittest of everything is going to flourish in that. And then everything else is going to be destroyed. So that's just the way it is. And, people may not like that, but I'm telling you, I've seen it time after time after time.
Russ, we've done over 1,700 shows on this channel. And one thing I found as I've grown, I matured in perspective, the books, having discussions like this, and, as corrections, everything you do in corrections has some balance on a fine line. Order and chaos, rehabilitation and safety. There's always a balance on a fine line, and you have to be able to navigate it. And this is the same thing here. When you're dealing with crucial incidences, how do you balance the needs of the facility with or let's just do that. Well, no, that's fine. The needs of the facility with the needs of the people. And it is a very find balance, because you can't let one overrun the other. And that, again, that's in everything in corrections. Just a little drop on one side can toss the scale in the wrong direction, and chaos occurs. And and it's funny because they talk about the scales of justice, and you have a scale, and I think corrections also is on a very balanced scale, which we try every day to kind of hold up perfectly. But a show like this, I think, was needed. I think it's something that is forgotten, dealing with the human emotion behind a conflict, and then working staff back towards something that, back towards normal operations. Let's just say that. But again, management will go quick to try to showcase control, and sometimes they forget about dealing with the human emotions before you can even establish the return. I like what Russ said before. I don't want to overlook that. Russ mentioned lockdown, and sometimes management will push the lockdown to show they have immediate control and let the public know they're okay, where some management will hold the lockdown down to make sure staff's okay, to make sure they're stabilized. So it's crazy how that perspective could shift, but it's true. One is controlling it just to show I have control, more of the vanity, and the other's controlling it to make sure that staff's okay. And sometimes you could tell which one's doing it for the right reasons when they release it. Usually the person that puts the control in quick because it's about vanity will also open it up quick. But for the people that do it for the right reasons, because they want to balance the emotions of their individuals, they keep it there just a little bit longer because they know that at this point we're not ready. Hey, Russ, anything you'd like to say in closing? It's a good topic.
Yeah. I've spent the past, I would say, week or two, talking to some individuals that have lost some correctional staff in the line of duty. And it was born of, working on this book that I've got going, Complacency in Corrections. And so, my heart just goes out to those people. They know who they are. I think that, I hope that, they find, peace with those things that went on. I hope that they can, make their institution a better place, if you will. I hope that they can make things safer for all. So safer for all is my mantra for tonight. And, I just felt like I needed to mention those people, because some of those people are, people I don't contact very often. But they contacted me about some materials that I wanted and needed, and they really came through. And, it's just a blessing to be part of the correctional family like that, and to, once again, connect and not just when times are hard.
Yeah. And you know what, guys, my closing remarks is, again, 2017, we lost Sergeant Megan Callahan. The facility family was devastated. And it was funny because the facility was overwhelmed. The people that worked were overwhelmed with emotion, but the family found a way to work through it and honor her while still moving forward. And I just thought there was a bittersweet beauty in that. But when we did the video recordings, I don't know what will ever happen, if those videos will ever be shown. I wish they would, because there was just tremendous interaction there. Even if it doesn't make it to a full movie, maybe one day they could release those interviews. If not, they'll be lost in time. But I was there. I interacted with the people that were affected directly by this fallen hero. And how do you rebuild after that? So this was an effort to show people that it is possible, but it's not easy. And when you're put in those higher positions, you have to work through it, because if you don't, the staff won't recover without you. It's just that simple. As always, guys, the show is Teardrop. If you haven't, please survive. Please survive. Well, talking about the critical incidents, I got survival in my head. Guys, the show is Teardrop. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bells will notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.